My name is Vincent Silk, and I work with LGBTIQ people who have experienced family violence.
My name is Alphonso, and I also work in LGBTIQ family violence. What does family violence look like in LGBTIQ relationships?
It could be all of the types of violence that we learn about, so that like physical, emotional, psychological, financial.
I mean, when we're talking about interpersonal violence, we're always talking about power and control. So anything that can be used or weaponized to exert power and control over someone is going to be utilized in a violent relationship. And in some ways that might look the same. So that might look like pushing and shoving, and we would recognize that as physical violence. But that also might mean weaponizing someone's sexuality or their gender identity against them. So, people might be surprised that homophobic or transphobic slurs might be directed at somebody as a form of violence in a relationship.
Yeah.
And you'd be like, oh, that's, how come? But they're both LGBTI. But anything that is going to have an effect, anything that's going to be a form of power and control. So, for example, if someone is a non-biological parent or a non-adoptive parent of a child in an LGBTI relationship, they might be really unclear about their rights to access that child if that intimate partnership breaks down. And that's something that somebody could weaponize against them to leverage them to stay as a form of power and control. If someone has a lot of internalized homophobia or transphobia or biphobia, then threats around outing them or derogatory, humiliating targeting of their gender identity or their sexuality are going to be really, really effective form of power and control. Or in the case of someone who, say, is HIV positive and has a lot of internalized stigma as well as a lot of discrimination present in the world, then threats to disclose their HIV status could be a really effective form of power and control. Yeah, so I think that's where they're the same is that we're talking about power and control, but those are some of the different specific ways that might manifest in LGBTI relationships. Anything that can be reflected at you externally, so boys would be boys, and men get together, when they get upset eventually there's going to be fisticuffs, it's not a big deal, women can't be violent, women can't perpetrate sexual violence. Anything that can be reflected at you externally about your relationship can also be internalized. So that can be an incredible barrier because people might take so long to come to realize in themselves, hang on, what I've experienced is violence, what I've experienced is sexual violence. Actually, this isn't just boys will be boys. I've worked with people before who the majority of the work was supporting them to understand the ways in which they'd been made unsafe was actually legitimately violence. And that's because of an internalization of those external myths.
Totally.
So it's so important to interrogate those to provide good support to people.
Yeah.
It doesn't make you a bad person or an ignorant person. It's really understandable that we've absorbed this stuff. Even LGBTI people, as I said, absorb this stuff. But just because you didn't choose it, it doesn't mean it's not your responsibility to unpack.
Okay.
Why don't LGBTI people report if it's that serious?
Yeah.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so there's lots of things in that question. The myths that we were just talking about, so an internalization of the fact that your violence is not that serious, that it won't be taken seriously, that what you're experiencing is not as serious as heterosexual cisgendered violence, so that's a factor. And the underreporting, it's really important not to take that as evidence of a lack of seriousness because when that doesn't happen, it's for good reason and it's a self-defense mechanism and people protecting themselves when they already feel very vulnerable. And we need to be able to work with that.
Aren't there heaps of family violence services out there for people experiencing family violence? Why don't LGBTI people just go to those?
So the mainstream family violence system is already stretched. And then you have LGBTIQ people, some of whom may be accessing the system either non-disclosing their identity or their sexuality. I think there's a real myth that people will automatically disclose. That's not necessarily the case. And then, of course, there's lots of people who would avoid the system altogether. And there's still a real lack of clarity and a real lack of resources. There's currently very poor access or no access to beds for cisgendered men, gay men who are fleeing violence, or trans men, or non-binary people. There's still no clear pathways into beds for non-binary people. Where would they go? And then for a lot of trans women or gender diverse femmes, that is fraud because they don't necessarily know what's going to happen to them if they do try to access a crisis service. And again, we know that an incredibly high risk time for someone is when they've made the decision to leave a violent relationship.
Yeah.
And people instinctively know that.
Yeah.
And behave in lots of protective ways. So if they know, and we know, that their risk is going to increase, but the pathways into service support are unclear, if they go to access that and then are bounced out for lack of beds or lack of resources or lack of an inclusive supportive service, we've actually put them at greater risk. So if they're not able to access services, where do LGBTI people go?
Yep. Friends, families, wherever
away,
far
away,
to interstate. Some people don't go anywhere, or some people have to stay. I think people make choices depending on where they will survive and what is most reasonable to them at the time.
What would you like to see change in how people work with LGBTI people experiencing family violence?
I would really like to see people start changing the way, how rigid they are about gender.
Yeah, and recognising that we don't have to throw the Duluth model, the power and control wheel. We don't have to throw the feminist history of the family violence movement out the window when we're talking about LGBTI family violence, because all of us grew up in a cisgenderist heteronormative world. We are all impacted by rigid understandings of gender roles and gender inequity. If we allow for diverse sexualities and diverse identities and diverse genders, then the patriarchal gender inequity that the family violence movement is built on and built on responding to, it collapses. Yeah. So we're all fighting the same fight. So I think I would like people to be able to connect those two dots. I actually think this work is incredibly transformative for everybody, not just LGBTIQ people and our relationships, but because it requires us to really grapple with and really unpack in a much more nuanced way gender and power and identity and the movement of power within relationship and the links between structural violence and interpersonal violence. It's actually incredibly transformative work across the board, and I think it will create more therapeutic and accessible and responsive service environments for everybody. You will probably already have engaged with people who are LGBTI somewhere on the rainbow and had absolutely no idea. So I think there's a real myth that people will disclose that you'll know if someone's LGBTI. That's not the case. And we actually, in order to create cultural change, we need to be providing an inclusive LGBTI affirmative environment at all times, whether or not we think that someone LGBTI is present. Otherwise, nothing's ever really going to change.